Sure. So the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in terms of country's population by 4-1, and in terms of military enrollment by 10-1, and in terms of potential draftable population by almost 20-1. They also are drawing upon 70 years of Soviet stockpiling. Now, we've all seen these these photos of rail lines where they're bringing in these old T-62 tanks that were built in the 60s and 70s and from Siberia, and we're like pointing and we're laughing. It's like, it's basically a can with a turret. It's not a great piece of equipment, but it's better than what the Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians didn't modernize their military at all since 1992. They've been relying upon ancient Soviet equipment that has not been maintained at all. And then they're reliant, of course, upon imports from the West, donations primarily. That's been working, but that has a shelf life. The issue is that we don't fight like the Russians and the Ukrainians do. We don't do set piece engagements with large scale artillery assaults and moving slowly. We do lightning strikes. We have an air force. We do deep penetration bombing. We use smart weapons to target logistical centers and command and control depots. The whole idea is, if with enough precise attacks, you can prevent the other side from functioning as a military in the first place, so they can't do a mass formation. That's how we fight. The equipment that you use for that is not something you train up for in a month or a year. That's a career. So the equipment that we can provide the Ukrainians with has to be, I don't want to say dumb, but certainly not hyper smart, something that they can learn in less than 3 months. And in many cases, it's been less than 2 weeks because they've been under so much pressure. So you're not talking tanks, you're not talking advanced artillery, except for very small groups of people who can be brought out of Ukraine to be trained. You're talking about things that your average Ukrainian can throw in a pickup or throw on their shoulder and run to the front. That's javelins, that's stingers. We've already exhausted half of our stockpile. So we're going to be at a point later this year where we have a large, low morale Russian force fighting with bad logistics and outdated equipment against a Ukrainian force that doesn't have weapons. There's no math there. And when that happens, the Russians are going to roll. If the Ukrainians are going to turn the tide, they have to do so in the next 3 to 5 months. There are certain things that they can hit that would break the Russian lines, but they're not easy to get to, especially with the equipment that the Ukrainians are able to use. So I don't want to say this is over, but the midterm forecast here is not a good one for you. Oh no, the Russians have always intended to not stop until they have all of Ukraine, but not stop when they have all of Ukraine. The Russian goal here is to plug a series of geographic access points that allow penetration from outside of the Russian space into it. So the Polish plain, for example, the Bessarabian Gap down in Romania is another one. And unfortunately, Ukraine is between Russia and those gaps. So when if the Russians feel that they have subjugated Ukraine enough, they will then expand the war into additional countries. Of the next 9 countries that the Russians are eyeing, 5 of them are in NATO. So the American plan here is to give the Ukrainians everything they can possibly use in order to prevent a direct American-Russian fight. One of the lessons we took from the Ukrainian war in its first week was that the Russians are not capable of complex operations, which is what we do best. So we know if we have a direct fight, the Russians are going to get obliterated. But the Russians see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they're right. So if we do have that fight, there is very little to dissuade them from using nukes, because from their point of view, they have nothing to lose. The matter that we think of modern economies. Now, this was probably happening anyway. The Russians were completely dependent upon Western tech to make their extractive sectors work. We're already starting to see the impact of some of that in their oil fields, especially in the eastern part of the country. And the Russian demography is among the worst in the world. So the Russian ethnicity was absolutely going to die out at some point over this next 80 years in the century. But if they cannot secure Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, then they've failed. And they have already locked in the price for launching the war. If they launch the war and fail, that really is the worst case scenario for them. And I find it unlikely they'd be able to capture as much as they feel they need to. So we are now in the witching hour of the Russian ethnicity. It will probably vanish. Russia will probably vanish over the course of the next 20 to 25 years. Now, if the Russians do manage to plug those gaps and get all the way to Warsaw and so on, that buys them a lot more time. But it doesn't end the It doesn't change the end destination here. Okay, so we knew as of 2 years ago that China was already the fastest aging workforce in human history. Since then, more data has come out, and it now suggests that by 2050, there'll be fewer than 650 million Chinese. So we're looking at an excess of a 50% drop in their population in 30 years, assuming nothing else goes wrong. So many other things are going wrong. We're going to lose Russian crude from the market, whether it's because of sanctions or boycotts or degradation in the field because they can't get the tech in that they need. That hits China more than anyone else. We're seeing disruptions in agricultural markets, and the Chinese are the world's largest importer of either foodstuffs or the stuff you need to grow foodstuffs. So we're looking at a catastrophic reduction in their ability to maintain their standard of living before you get into the manufactured side of the equation. Already, there is not a manufacturing product that can be made in China at a lower cost than can be made in North America. Their labor is already aged out. The only reason we think of China as a manufacturing power today is because of the sunk cost of the industrial plant. You have to rebuild that. That doesn't happen overnight. That's not free. We're working on it. But there's no way that China emerges from this decade as a consolidated power. They won't have the people, they won't have the economy, they won't have the energy to keep the lights on. Most Chinese governments, going back for the long 3,500 years of Chinese history, have collapsed because of internal issues. Because you've got a strongly centralized system that tries to suppress everything, and that means you get bureaucratic sclerosis, which ultimately consumes the country from within. Or you get regional power mongers who basically take matters into their own hands and basically secede from the state, and it turns into a war zone among all these little principalities. We are at the extreme of the first at the moment. We will see the extreme of the other one within a decade. I don't think it's an incorrect measurement. You just have to take it in context with a lot of other things. So think of GDP like a baseball. If you throw it up, it goes faster and faster, and then slower and slower and slower and slower and slower. And at the peak, just before it falls, it's the highest it's ever been. China's basically been on that upward curve now for 40 years, but as their demographic situation gets worse and worse, the pace of increase is slowing. And I'm assuming here that Chinese data is a little fabricated anyway. That's just how things are. It's entirely possible that they're past the peak already. I don't know. I don't have access to the internal files of the Chinese system, which actually, let me back up. They don't collect what we would consider a real GDP number. So it's not like we could penetrate their information networks and get that number and find out what the truth is. No, they just don't do it. So their numbers are estimates that come from regional leaders who are trying to succour favor with the central government. And so everything is always inflated. And we've seen that now, that untruth unwind with the demographic data. That's how we know where they're missing 100 million people. They just fabricate them in order to get better subsidies. But you have to take into account what goes into the GDP data. Labor force for China, for evaluated economy, is always going to be the most important piece, and they just don't have that labor force any longer. So anything else that piles on top of this, an energy crisis, a materials crisis, a trade crisis, a transport crisis, all of which were in progress, just makes it worse. Well, let's split this into two categories. First of all, most of the countries that we consider competitors, China, Russia, Iran, they are so dependent on globalization. Really, the question should be how are we preparing for their weakness rather than their strength? One of the mistakes that we made in the early post-Cold War years when the Russians fell down is we were neither supportive enough of the Russians to help them become something better and different, nor were we willing to put a bullet into Russia's head to make sure that they were never a threat again. We just kind of muddled through and ignored it. If we do that again, we will, a generation from now, face similar complications in the East Asian and the Middle Eastern and then the Far Eastern theaters. So a little forethought for that I would always support. Second, internally, labor. We need a broad spectrum training program that allows people over age 12 and under age 40 to basically go back and learn a new skill. There was some talk early on in the post-COVID recovery of rebuilding the Conservation Corps, which is a program that we had back in the 1930s, which did just that. I think some sort of reinvention of that would be a great idea. There are also some programs within the education department that I think are worth expanding. So, for example, the U.S. government will pay for part of your education to become a teacher if you put in 4 years in a school district that has trouble recruiting teachers. You do something like that across the entire workspace, especially in the trades. I can't imagine any state or local government.
Where would folks go to get that?
It's doing well enough that it should be available anywhere, not just on the online platforms, but also in any sort of physical format.